Welcome everybody. Happy Father's Day too for those of us with that status. And this is another one in the theme of classic wine regions of Australia. I'll just give you a reminder of the other ones that we've done already. We've had this topic before, and I'll just get to the there we are. And so we, in previous sessions, we actually have went through those regions, and tonight we're going to go in a moment. In fact, we'll probably go right now, because those of us who've got the wines have got a glass of Riesling in front of us, which I think is the appropriate wine to start with. And we're talking about the Great Southern region in Western Australia. And you can see there that the whole of that greyish area in the southern part of Western Australia, that's all Great Southern. There are sub-regions of it. So here's Perth up here. And it's quite a drive. It's 3.5, maybe 4 hours all the way down to Mount Barker, which is sort of either Mount Barker or Albany are the biggest towns there. But Frankland River itself is this rather small place, just sort of over on the western side. The interesting thing about Great Southern is that when you drive into the region from Margaret River, which is over here, or the Bunbury region through here, when you drive across into the Great Southern area, about where my mouse is hovering, there's a slight hilly range. I wouldn't call it a mountain range, but nonetheless, you go over some altitude and you wind through some hills, and then you sort of emerge into this area here. And that sort of ridge, if you like, means that all the rainfall that falls in this area flows southwards in south-flowing rivers into the Southern Ocean. Whereas if you're back in this area here to the north, the water that falls there flows westwards in various rivers and out into the Indian Ocean. The effect of that is that the air mass and the wind that blows over this Great Southern area is wind off the Southern Ocean, and it's famously very cold. So in a relatively short distance from Margaret River here, which is a famously very mild region, from Margaret River across the Great Southern is maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours, I suppose. Of Margaret River to Frankland River is about an hour and a half, I suppose. And but the countryside changes dramatically, and of course the climate changes hugely as well. So there we are with the Great Southern area. It has been, there's grapes been grown in various parts of it for a long time, but it's probably really only been coming to prominence since about the 1990s, and it seems to have settled down for a number of different varieties. But certainly Frankland River's pretty well known for Riesling. And there are two quite big producers there. Alcumi's one of them, and Frankland River Estates the other. And if you go looking for Rieslings in bottle shops, you'll find their wines pretty easily. And they're another sort of they're another Riesling that you might put on alongside other classic Australian Rieslings, such as Clare Valley and Eden Valley in South Australia, both very well-known historic Australian classic regions for Riesling. The Great Southern or Frankland River areas has its own Riesling challenge every year to promote, Rieslings generally, but also let the world know that Frankland River makes a Riesling. So to this particular wine, some of you have got it, I have it, and there it is behind me there. It's you'll notice that it's a very floral lime juice aroma. It's a bit, it doesn't have that rather intense lime juice that you tend to get on Clare Valley, or the rather intense lemony, lemon floral characters you see on Eden Valley. Nonetheless, it's certainly got a very, very approachable, very distinctive flavour. It's almost a little bit grapey. You know, there's a certain sort of floral, grapey, soft limes aroma to it. On the palate, it's a bit juicy. It's got a reasonable level, you know, when I say reasonable, fairly high level of underlying acidity, and yet there's a firmness lurking behind that softness, which I find is a bit of a trait of Frankland River district Rieslings. In fact, Frankland River estate itself can make some really minerally, very acidic, firm Rieslings, which can age very nicely. Certainly, I find as a generalisation, Frankland River Rieslings are a bit more savoury, a bit more mineral, probably a bit like a Trocken German Riesling, that is a German Riesling without any grapiness or sweetness in it. And they're a very mineral style compared to that rather intense forward limes flavour that you tend to get on Clare Valley. But in terms of Australian Riesling, which is you know, this is such a classic grape variety for Australia. If you were going to put Australian Rieslings in front of anybody, you would be going to Clare Valley, Eden Valley, and Frankland River. They're three regions, I think you would say. There's claims by others of other regions that make really good Riesling, and that's true. But in terms of, you know, volumes and been doing it for quite some time, they're the regions. I mean, other areas that you might think of for Riesling would be Great Western in Victoria, and Bess have a very famous one. Down south from there towards the coast, Crawford River is a producer in the Henty area, which is a very famous Riesling. Around Canberra, there's a producer called Helm, and Helms promotes Riesling pretty strongly, and they have a big annual Riesling challenge in Canberra and so on. So there are other areas, but I think Frankland River is there. Any questions or comments about Riesling or Frankland River? No, enjoying the wine, Frederick? Yeah, see you nodding there. It's not a Germanic style, is it? It's a very forward. It's got a lot of that lime juice style to it. There's a bit of estuary character on it as well.
Yes, but what we were saying that it was absolutely delightful. It was this sort of Riesling we really like this, and for us that was a bit of a discovery, but different than the German Rieslings. But we really, really love this style.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
It has considerable length, Andrew.
Yeah, it does. And some persistence as well. So it's got a fair bit of concentrate on it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's good, David. It's quite attractive when you first sip it. There's a lot of perfume on it. So that's quite attractive. Whereas sometimes young Clare Valley Rieslings can be a bit austere. 2021, so it's pretty young. Very, very, very lifted, very, very perfumed.
So Andrew, I've got a question. I don't have that Riesling. I've got a Pikes Clare Valley Riesling.
Yep.
Which seems quite austere, 2021. So
yep, that's right.
Would that be very different to the one you're drinking?
Yes. So Clare Valley would be a lighter, probably more acidic, more steely tasting wine. Now it's probably got that unsweetened lime juice cordial aroma on it. Like a lime juice aroma, whereas the one we have has got this really wildflowers floral character on it. So Clare Valley Riesling 2021 would probably be considered too bit young, and it's just been released. So I think even just a year of bottle age for a Clare Valley Riesling would make a huge difference. Whereas this particular Frankland River Riesling now has obviously. He's for such a young wine he's very perfumed and very drinkable.
Andrew,
yeah.
We're drinking a 2018
Yep.
Frankland estate. What would the difference be between what we're drinking and what you're drinking?
So yours would by now have a little bit of richness and a bit of viscosity to it. It should still have quite a steely acidity, I think. It should have quite a floral, almost like not exactly dried wildflowers, but flower arrangements, sort of floral character and a little bit of that sort of very sweet kind of limes grapiness as well, I think is what you'd have for 2018. It should still be quite firm.
It is, yes.
It'll probably be fuller bodied than, say, a Clare Valley Riesling of the same vintage.
Okay.
That's quite, yeah, good.
Andrew,
Yeah.
sorry.
Can I ask a question, Andrew?
Yeah.
Is there much enthusiasm amongst Riesling producers to play around with the wine, doing odd things like barrel aging or fermenting on skins, or do they all just want to make a pristine classic Riesling, Australian Riesling style?
I think the majority are probably the latter. Having said that, there are certainly some significant producers that are becoming well known who are definitely having a play. There's one called Riesling Freak, which is a producer in Clare Valley who actually makes Rieslings, and he calls them number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, I think. And they have variants on the things you just mentioned: overnight skin contact.
Okay.
You know, that different ones. And in that his label's one of those hipster-looking labels. So he's actually taken a very a conservative wine style, namely Australian Riesling, and the packaging's very very hipster. So it's got this big Riesling Freak, and then there's the number underneath it, you know, and you got to look in the fine print on the back label to see what vintage it is. And of course, in the sort of sommelier scene, sort of Melbourne and Sydney, once people can start going to restaurants again, those kind of wines are quite popular, as distinct from the middle of the road ones, which, yes, as you said, considered probably a bit old fashioned. So there are producers. The main one I know is O'Leary Walker, who's a large, small producer in Clare Valley. And they have obviously their middle of the road, conservatively made Rieslings, which they make quite big volumes of. But they've got some other labels that they've introduced where they're having a play. And they've got one that's a sort of a takeoff of the Rheingau wine, and they call it the Doctor's Cut, and as in, you know, the Doctor Vineyard in the Rheingau, and it's an overnight skin contact and a portion in oak for a short period of time, and so they're trying, you know, they've got both bases, so they can actually sell their mainstream Riesling, but they've also got this slightly alternative product that they can offer to that on-premise market that wants something different. So, but yes, generally speaking, as you know, Riesling's such an intriguing marketing concept. You know, what is it? 90% of Riesling's made in South Australia, and about 90% of that 90% stays in South Australia, where the South Australians consume it, and a bit leaks out to the other states, and women don't like it, and older blokes do like it, and that's about it. That's what they say, you know, as a marketing generalisation. That's the issue with Riesling. But I'm an old bloke and I love Riesling. So
we like it too. We like it. Rebecca likes it. It's our whited choice.
Oh, very good. Yeah, no, I like it. Barbara doesn't like it. She'd rather have anything else. But so not so much Riesling. Anyway,
it's better than bloody Sauvignon Blanc, that's for sure.
Yeah, no. Well, we'll talk. we'll talk politely about that. I'm going to just quickly show you now the Mornington Peninsula here, and then I'm going to introduce Gary again to talk about it. So, okay, so there's the Mornington Peninsula. There's a purple arrow pointing to it. The obvious thing looking at the map is there's Melbourne. You can see my mouse hovering around. And there are a number of wine regions that surround Port Phillip Bay, as you can see, the circuit. The obvious thing about the Mornington Peninsula is that it's surrounded almost on 3 sides by ocean. You've got the Port Phillip Bay here, and then you've got the bay on the other side, and the peninsula sticks out into the ocean here. So the Mornington Peninsula is characterised by a very mild but cool maritime influenced climate. And it's also being so close to Melbourne and Mornington Peninsula being where, you know, Melburnians went on holidays traditionally, it's meant that Mornington Peninsula wines are very available to Melbourne wine enthusiasts. So it's been a region which has got a lot of publicity over the years. I had a quick look today, but I'm going to get Gary to talk about it. There were some wineries, but not so much. And then there was one sort of small pioneer, which was actually the Ballier family in Melbourne that started a small winery there. But the main pioneer who really established a substantial vineyard and winery and put the Mornington Peninsula on the map for premium wine in the 1980s, effectively, was Gary Crittenden, who's there looking at us. So Gary, over to you. Tell us about the history and what took you there, and the, you know, the climate and what you've done, because your story in investigating the varieties to plant and produce is a story that you do hear around from pioneers such as Gary, who probably when you started there was no one to tell you what to do, so you had to sort of do a bit of trial and error. But anyway, over to Gary Crittenden.
That's true. In fact, it was largely trial and error, and I guess I had, for want of a better description, the good fortune to have an agricultural science background, so to some extent with the ability to go out and do the research. You're right in saying it was the Meyer family. Actually, it was Baillieu Meyer from the Meyer family, Sidney Meyer's son, who planted the first grapes on the Mornington Peninsula, of modern day plantings, in 1972. So his plantings, and they were just a few rows, are now 50 years old. My wife, Margaret, and I were keen wine drinkers. I had a plant nursery in Mount Eliza, just at the northern end of the Mornington Peninsula. And it was a prosperous time for nurserymen. We were doing well financially, and I had good friends who were keen wine enthusiasts. So we would meet frequently, and we would wank on about this wine and that wine, and like
I don't believe it.
like experts. And then in 1978, I had become besotted with French wine. It was one of the few failings of my life in the wine sphere, as I just sort of got to the point where I couldn't see past French wine. In 1978, Margaret and I took our two children, Zoe, who was 3 years old, and Rollo, who was then 18 months old, for a holiday to Tasmania. We flew across, we hired a car, and we drove all around Tasmania, just stopping here and there at random. And in Hobart, we all went, the whole family went into a restaurant one evening, and Muir's Fish House, very famous then and still quite famous now, I think. And on the menu was a wine that purported to be from Tasmania, something of which I'd never heard. So I said to the waiter, "Oh, I see, this wine is made on the mainland and it's brought across in 44-gallon drums. You bottle it here, call it Tasmanian." He was highly offended and said, "No, this wine is grown on the banks of the Derwent River in the northern suburbs of Hobart at a place called Berrydale by a very famous Tasmanian, he was then, by the name of Claudio El Corso at Morilla Estate." And I said, "Well, you know, this is all news to me. Do you mean to say you do actually grow grapes here in Tasmania?" And he said, "Yes, we do." He is one of the leaders, but there are a few beginning to pop up. anyway, he told me a little bit about Claudio and Marilla Estate, and I went back to the motel where we were staying in Hobart that night, and I looked in the telephone directory. In those days, you had a paper thing, and you opened it up, and it had Marilla Estate. No, it had El Corso, Claudio. It didn't have Marilla Estate. So I thought, oh well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was only about 8 or 8:30, and I dialed the number, and Claudio himself answered the phone, and I said, look, I've just had what's a bottle of your Riesling in a restaurant, Riesling, note, in Hobart, and I'm quite fascinated. I'm interested in wine, and I was unaware that you had an industry here. What are the chances of coming to visit you? To which Claudio said, I'm playing golf in the morning, but if you come at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I will give you a tour. So we all turned up, Margaret and the 2 kids, and Claudio was an amazingly generous host. He opened bottle after bottle of wine and spoke to them. I tasted wines there that were just so, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but just so, for want of a better term, classically French in style and character, that it was a revelation to me. I was used to Victorian wine, South Australian wine, Hunter Valley wine, but not Australian wine with the astonishing freshness and brightness that I was seeing in Claudio's Pinot Noir, Riesling, Gewürztraminer. I had a Gewürztraminer on that day that could have been from Alsace. Anyway, that was an amazing introduction, and we finished our holiday, came back to Melbourne, where we were living in Frankston, and I mulled this over at length, and about a fortnight later, I said to Margaret, you know, I've had a great idea. I think it'd be terrific if we sold up everything and moved to Tasmania to grow grapes. To which she said, you might find it a bit lonely. I got a very clear picture. Anyway, it wasn't much. It was a year or so after that our children were in preschool and what have you, and I bumped into Nat White from Main Ridge Estate, whose children were going to the same school. I soon established that he had an acre or so of grapes at Red Hill, or Main Ridge to be precise, and he invited me down, and I could have been back in Tasmania. The characters of the wines he was making were just so similar to Tasmanian. So it was a great relief for Margaret and we didn't have to sell up everything and go to Tasmania. We did it here. I searched around for a couple of years till I found the block of land that I thought suited my purpose, and bought it. And in September, exactly 39 years ago this month, in September 1982, in one weekend, we planted 5 acres of vines, predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon, a little bit of Merlot, and just a row or 2 of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. In that one weekend, we doubled the entire aggregated plantings of the Mornington Peninsula. If you added Bailey Meyer, what he had planted, to Nat White, to George Kefford, to Brian Stonier, they could just manage 5 acres between them. So we took the Mornington Peninsula plantings from 5 acres to 10 acres in one weekend. Today, there is in excess of 2,500 acres. So what's that? 1,000 hectares of grapes here, and something like, I'm told, 70 vineyards and growers with their own brands. So in 40 years, we've gone from virtually nothing to being fairly significant players at a certain level in the Australian wine scene. Just as a footnote, in 1987, I did plant 20 acres of vines in the Coal River Valley in Tasmania, a few of us got together and planted Toll Puddle vineyards. And I owned Toll Puddle from 87 when we planted it till the late 90s, when the financial pressures of what I was doing here, where I'm sitting today, meant that I had to sell my share, about which I have some regrets. I mean, Toll Puddle has gone on to be quite internationally famous. It has the right people behind it now, I guess. So anyway, that's a potted version of the Peninsula. Why did I plant Cabernet and not Pinot Noir, even though I loved Burgundy? Because I did what's known as a homoclime study, where you take your climate, and I had long climate records for my site here in Dramana. I had climate records, and I compared that with other places around the world, Burgundy included, sorry, not around the world. I did the homoclime study with France, and the hands down winner was Bordeaux. Our climate here on the Peninsula then and now was far better suited to far more closely allied with Bordeaux than Burgundy. So I planted Cabernet. It's worth noting that our 1985 vintage Cabernet was chosen by James Halliday to represent Australia in a then international competition, annual competition between South Africa, Australia. It was limited to Cabernet only, South Africa, Australia, and California. So I take that as some recognition. Why did things change when the climate didn't? Well, what changed was, as more people planted, they tended to be, back in the early days, in the first decade or so, they were hobby farmers, and I don't use that in a derogatory term, but they were people who just thought it'd be nice to have a few acres of vines at their weekender, because they came down every weekend and they could invite their friends around for dinner on a Saturday night and say, look, have a glass of my wine. Cabernet, Nat White had more Cabernet than Pinot Noir. Bales Meyer had Cabernet. George Kefford had Cabernet, so we all had Cabernet. But the Peninsula goes from sea level, which is virtually where I am, to an altitude of 1,000 feet, not high by mountainous terrain, but once you get up onto the volcanic soils, and I'm not on volcanic soil, I'm on a sandy loam, down low near the ocean, but once you get up onto the deep red volcanic soils, you get vast amounts of vigor and much cooler. It's a much cooler climate. Rainfall is much higher. The accumulated heating degree days, those things that go to mature and ripen grapes, are much lower at altitude. And what happened was a lot of Cabernet was being put on the market that was, for want of a better description, green. It had the character of capsicum, tomato, and the public turned their nose up at those characters. What do you mean? This is not Cabernet as we know it. Where's the ripe character of Cabernet? It got to the point where eventually even James Halliday, notwithstanding the fact he'd chosen our 1985 to represent Australia in an international competition, was saying that Cabernet is not the variety for the Mornington Peninsula. It's a big mistake, and they'd all better rethink what they're doing. So Cabernet was pulled out, and Pinot, not pulled out, but we segued across to Pinot Noir as the main red variety. So from that day on, the main varieties have been Pinot Noir with success and justification, and Chardonnay. I've taken up far more time than you're allowed.
Let's taste this particular Pinot and talk about Mornington Peninsula Pinot, and then I've got a couple of other questions for you about some of your other projects that you've done since then. But those of us that got the Mornington Peninsula Pinot, or this particular one, I think it's again generalising. Gary will probably have a certain view on this too. Mornington Peninsula Pinot seems to have some generosity about it, I think, compared to, say, Yarra Valley Pinot Noir. And there's certainly a red cherry, red fruit generosity on the aroma and the palate in general of Mornington Peninsula Pinots would be sort of how I would see them. The particular one we have here is certainly that. It's stick your nose in it, and it's quite a forward, ripe, fairly red cherry, bit of cherry pip part of the spectrum. We can talk about the complexity in a moment. And on the palate, it's quite a silky. It says 12.5%, but it certainly has a silky viscosity to it that would say that the 12.5%, is quite a low alcohol to have such a rich, viscous, generous, fleshy palate feel. In terms of it being a textbook classic Pinot Noir, it certainly fills the bill. It's got the aroma, and it's got that mid-palate, fleshy velvet feel that you just don't get off other varieties. It's got some nice persistence. The wine's very enjoyable. You could probably be a little bit critical about some estuary character on it and a few other things, but in terms of it showing, a middle of the road Mornington Peninsula Pinot Noir, I think this particular wine's doing a good job.
I think it does that very well, yes.
Yeah.
Middle of the road is right.
Yeah. So, Gary, tell us about Pinot Noir now and, the different bits and pieces that are taking place with Mornington Pinot Noirs.
Well, a fascinating insight is that when we first planted here, we would harvest Pinot Noir typically in late March. It would be very unusual to pick it earlier than the third week in March, quite often the last week in March, and occasionally the first week in April. Today, the earliest we've ever picked Pinot is in very late, the last day or two of February, and typically we pick Pinot in the first week and sometimes the second week in March. So vintages come forward by, to put a round number on it, 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks, sometimes 4. 20 vintage was interesting, and I'm fascinated by the alcohol at 12 or whatever it is.
Yeah, 12.5, yeah.
Yeah. And my guess is that he might have picked you, of course, although we were monitoring for smoke taint constantly, because we had days on end here where the air was redolent of bushfire smoke, and of course that's a great concern. I'm wondering if in fact he didn't pick earlier, just in an effort to get it off before there was any smoke taint does its damage once veraison takes place. Up until veraison, colouring and ripening starts, you don't get much damage from smoke taint. But the minute you get into that, and the longer you leave it, the more likelihood you will have of smoke taint. So I'm wondering if in fact he picked early in an effort to. The peninsula is fascinating in that because of its topography and the terrain and aspects, and it produces quite many different styles normally, and it took the growers years. That those who wanted to be classicists, of course, planted their vineyards rigidly on the Burgundy model, very narrow rows, very narrow vine spacing, short canes, never spur pruned. It took a while for us to get our handle on what to do. I think we've got it right now. We're not narrow row here. We're much narrower than the early days, but we still have space between the vines. But I think the real work now is done. I wouldn't say we've got command of the viticulture, because you can always learn something. What we've learned is the critical importance of the soil microbiome. We took out a major international award in 2020. Rollo had to go to America accepted for our contribution to sustainability. We've abandoned the use of artificial fertilizers. We rely entirely on compost that we make on the site here from grape marc, our own production. We don't use herbicides in the vine rows. And we have seen an astonishing, truly astonishing change in the soil, and subsequent to that, of course, in the way the canopy grows, the way the grapes mature. And we put a lot of our current success down to what we've been doing since about 2007 in the vineyard. So viticulture plays a major role. And of course, it took us years to get a handle on that. I think last time we spoke about stemmy characters in a wine. I forget which one, but we now, at our very top level, we fruit thin. We drop bunches on the ground if we have to get our cropping levels down, to get the right level of full maturity. We pluck leaves if we have to. We hide bunches in the canopy if we have to. We use all sorts of manipulation, but we also do, for our top wines, a whole raft of techniques like whole bunch ferments. And we spoke about whole bunch ferments last time, I think, Andrew. Connection with what, I'm not sure, but where you don't crush the grapes, you simply dump them in the fermenter and put a cover of juice across the top and let the ferment take place on the bunches and the stems. So you're actually fermenting the fruit on the stems. And of course, there've been a lot of mistakes made with green stems. You must have very mature, ripe, brown stems, or you'll get aggressive tannins and unpleasant characters. So that's our experience with Pinot Noir. Rightly or wrongly, we are regarded as a premier player in Pinot Noir, equalled only by Tasmania. I would say. Would you have issue with that, Andrew?
No, not at all. And I think that in a lineup of Australian Pinot Noir, I know from experience that some of the juicier districts of Tasmania are very difficult to pick apart from Mornington Peninsula. There's a hedonistic, juicy intensity that is that you get East Coast and Tasmanian East Coast and up the Derwent River and other parts of Tasmania. I think very difficult to pick some of those wines apart from Mornington Peninsula in my experience. There are outliers, of course, but if you want a satisfying, elegant but satisfying, intense, hedonistic Pinot Noir, they're the two regions, Tasmania and Mornington Peninsula, and it would be my recommendation.
Yes.
Gary, what after you made all the progress with the vineyards there and the brand, you did a study on Italian varieties in Australia back at a very pioneering stage, and then in fact did go and plant a few other bits and pieces there. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, as in all the years I was sort of making a living growing grapes and making wine here, I was also running a viticultural consulting business that in fact was national. I even did some consulting in Queensland.
Yeah, the Granite Belt, I remember that.
The Granite Belt. So I consulted there. I didn't consult in the Hunter. They didn't need me. But certainly right across southern Victoria, down into Tasmania, I did a lot of consulting. And even over in Margaret River, I planted Brooklyn Valley and created great controversy there by abandoning the rather old-fashioned techniques of grape growing that they had at the time, and recommending vertical shoot positioning, a la the French technique, not for the sake of doing it the French way, but because I believe it's the right thing to do. And that became quite controversial in Margaret River. So much so that Vanya Cullen's father told me at a dinner we attended once, we don't need you blokes here telling us how to do things.
Yep.
So Andy, I got a question.
Yeah.
I don't have Gary's wine, unfortunately, but I do have a Mornington Peninsula Pinot Noir one. It's a Montalto, and it's 2014. So does Pinot Noir, is that a good one to keep longer, or is it better to drink it younger?
That's one of the more interesting questions. I lean in the drink younger. Gary, what about you?
Yes, I do. I'm not a great fan of aged wines, full stop. That's not to say that there aren't some great aged wines, but I've always gone for freshness and youthfulness. Having said that, I did a tasting in London in 2019, where I actually air freighted across for a small private dinner of about 10 people, including media. Our Pinots going back to 1987. Now we checked them before sending them. We didn't just send them across and say we hope these taste right. I actually went to the dinner, and by and large, I was happy with what we poured on the night, and the assembled media and some key wine trade were very complimentary of how well the wines had aged. Now, having said that, they wouldn't be my everyday drink.
Okay.
I think the issue.
This one's 2014. It's very nice.
Yeah.
Top grower, Montalto, of course.
Is it? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you visited the Peninsula?
Yeah, we had lunch there. I think we bought it and we had lunch.
Makes sense.
Oh, it's good. It's probably quite a big, rich style now, Mike. It's probably very viscous and full body by now, I think. Montalto.
Yeah, it's got a big
bit of age on it like that. Okay. All right. Well, what I'll do is we'll sneak across and look at our third wine, and then we can, with our time available, we can see if there are any more questions and comments for Gary. And I've got a couple of other questions for him as well. But let's just talk about the third wine for a moment. And we have to. We've also, of course, Ken, we've got to go to you before we finish tonight for a wine of the week. And we have to go to Frederick for a recipe of the week to match one of these wines. Of course, I know you've been thinking about it for ages, but let's do that. I'll just show you where we are now with going to the Adelaide Hills. I'll just have to. Okay, so. Here we are in South Australia, and you can see, obviously, Barossa Valley is that purple bit. Adelaide Hills is actually a very large region, typically, although not nearly as many vineyards and grapes planted there as the Barossa Valley. The Adelaide Hills can really be considered in two bits. There's a much higher altitude, more arid, cold part to the north and to the east. And then there's a part of Adelaide Hills that basically joins down into the back of McLaren Vale. If you can sort of see, there's McLaren Vale on the coast. When you drive up from McLaren Vale, you go up into the hills pretty quickly, and that's still part of the Adelaide Hills. My thought is that from the wines I've seen over the years, that the wines of the bit of Adelaide Hills that are grown closer to McLaren Vale are grown in a warmer area, or less cold area, shall we say, and are riper, more forward, sort of bigger, whereas wines in the cold, more northern easterly part of the Adelaide Hills are more acidic, more savoury, more subtle. Our Shiraz tonight comes from a part of the Adelaide Hills that's sort of towards the McLaren Vale bit, so it's not in the coolest part. So there is quite a bit of diversity of Adelaide Hills when you start shopping around looking for the wines from the area. I guess Adelaide Hills is famous for Chardonnay, but also Shiraz, which invariably Adelaide Hills producers like to make it in a Rhone style. And the term Syrah is very common on Adelaide Hills Shiraz. And the particular one we have here is in fact labelled Syrah, and it is labelled with 13.5%. So not too high. To the wine, for those of you that have it, and it's certainly got lifted, quite developed, I think, quite developed bright red fruits character. And it's for 2016, it's surprisingly developed, surprisingly aged and developed. To taste it, it's certainly quite full-bodied, and it's full-bodied. It's a little bit spicy. I think that the issue with it is that the texture and complexity that it has is a bit lacking. It's not bad in terms of the persistence, so I can taste it on. It actually tastes more alcoholic than the label says. It actually tastes quite warm to me, and anyway, it says 13.5 there. So, but it tastes. If I had to guess it, I would have thought it tasted more alcoholic than that. So it's an example. I think that even though it says Adelaide Hills, this wine is probably more of a style you'd associate with McLaren Vale than Adelaide Hills. That's how you'd sum it up. Jericho itself is a pretty well-known new wave producer. I see the latest Gourmet Traveller wine magazines got a bit of a mention on Jericho as being one of the sort of new wave of modern Australian producers. I think this particular wine's not particularly new wave and not particularly modern, but anyway, that's just how these things pan out. So I think we're looking at a style of Shiraz that's more towards that riper McLaren Vale style, and I guess that sits with the part of the Adelaide Hills that it originates. So any comments or questions about Adelaide Hills or that wine or other wines from Adelaide Hills? I think it's worth seeking Adelaide Hills Chardonnay. That was something else I was thinking of putting on. I guess the good ones tend to be quite expensive, but there's certainly some marvellous Chardonnay in the Adelaide Hills, and some of Australia's best. So the original Petaluma, now the Terre Arterre brand rebadged, Shaw and Smith. There's a couple of Penfolds wines. Their famous Yatana has got some Adelaide Hills. I lose track of Penfolds Yatana because vintage in, vintage out, they changed the origin. But they also have Penfolds have a Bin 311, I think it's called, which is an Adelaide Hills Chardonnay, which is, I think, pretty smart and not too expensive. So Adelaide Hills famous for Chardonnay, but also it's got this following for the Syrah style Shiraz. So that's what we have. I think we might just jump across quickly to Frederick. Would you've been you could tell us, you're in the chair with the dishes that you'd stand out for you for any of the wines we've had tonight.
So I thought of doing something different instead of, because we always tell about this Belgian, French, German dishes, which is very exotic for a lot of people. So I thought something closer to home, which is a Peking duck. and no, what happened is that yesterday we had a Peking duck, and so like the duck leg, and put it into the pancake thing. And actually, I thought it went well with all three wines. So we started yesterday, and it went well with the Riesling, it went well with the Pinot Noir, and with the Syrah. And so I don't know if I'm telling any blasphemies here, and I'm happy to hear what you think about that, but that sort of matched with everything.
Yep, no, it sounds wonderful to me. I'm certainly another one. I probably would be kicked out for heresy, but I tend to lean towards almost all wines go with almost all foods. There are some clashes which you avoid, but it's amazing how flexible it can all be. I mean, there's a bit of a quasi-science on food and wine matching, but I'm not that big a follower. I've had lots of interesting combinations like you have. It sounds terrific.
Frederick, when you said local, I thought you were going to say a meat pie.
Yes, not so local.
I think it's cute that Peking duck is local.
Closer than Belgium.
We actually live in
It's closer to home. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Ken, you've had duck as well, and you've probably got a wine of the week for us as well.
Yes, all sorts of interesting wines lately, but since many of them are not easily obtainable, there's not really a great deal of point in me telling you about them. But that one I showed you when I first came on was one a friend of mine brought over last night for dinner, a Savenier.
Yeah, well,
and it's a very good one. It's the oh god, it's got some difficult name. Famille Fourier-Longchamp.
This is a Chenin Blanc, a Loire Chenin Blanc.
Chenin Blanc. It doesn't taste like Chenin Blanc, though. I'm sure most people who tasted it would not spot it as Chenin Blanc.
There you go.
Anyway, wine of the week.
Yep.
You'll have to correct me if I've already told you about this one. The Kangaroo Island Islander Sangiovese. Have I spoken about this before?
No, you haven't.
I believe it's available. I think I got it through the Qantas Wine Club. I think it's really interesting. And of course, Gary, I dare say, will be interested. Do you know it, Gary?
I had to go and throw another log on the fire as you introduced the wine. So just
the Kangaroo Island.
Yes, I do.
Islander Sangiovese.
Yes, I do. Yes,
that's Jacques Leton, isn't it, Gary?
It's yes, exactly.
It is. What's the Frenchman doing?
Transcontinental fusion. I think it's delightful, and it's still available from what do you call that Qantas place? The people that don't fly planes anymore. So yes, but the other one I want to mention, because I want some comments on it from you guys, is 242, the new Roederer 242 non-vintage. Has anyone tried it yet?
No, waiting to get a bottle. It's apparently
I've got some on the way at the moment, transport being suitable, feasible to North Queensland, but they've dispatched it. God knows how long it'll take to arrive. But the reason I wanted to mention it was because several people have given it very good reviews, and I've every reason to suspect it's going to be very satisfactory. But I was very, very surprised to see that it may have been a misreport, but the report I saw said that Jancis Robinson, who's a Roederer fan, she's always saying, and I agree with her, that the Roederer NV is a benchmark NV wine. She's only given it 88 points. Does anybody know anything about that?
Don't know. I have to look at her site. I've got access to her site. Have to take a look.
I keep meaning to subscribe to it, but I've never quite got round to it, because we try to buy Australian wines, not French wines. Sorry, Frederick. I just, so much of it's to do with wines that we just wouldn't buy that I gave up on it. Well, perhaps I ought to just go back onto it. Anyway, yes. So I shall be very interested to hear anyone else's comments on the new Roederer 242. And of course, I don't know how many of you know, but the guy at Roederer, who's obviously quite a progressive and very eminent, champagne mover and groover, they're adopting a new policy for the non-vintage wines. So I'm sure Andrew can say more about it than I can.
Oh, it's part of this sort of new champagne. Quite a few of them giving the actual information, which before was never explained. Where they actually say where it was grown and what vintages it's from and how long they've aged it and all that sort of thing. I think the name 242 is a play on the actual.
It's the 242nd cuvee or blah blah whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So they'll presumably go to 243, and so Laura's dropped off now, but she's keen on that sort of thing, and she knows a bit about it. So we'll get her to talk about it another time. Gary, we should come back to you. I'm interested about the with the alternative varieties that you then went exploring. So you mentioned some of the things you did, but your interest in Sauvignon, or that variety that you've got some various wines that you're keen on. Tell us about that experiment and that alternative variety.
Well, it wasn't so much an experiment as a mistake. I for my sins, as an old Gregory Terrace boy, I have to confess, I walked the Camino. I've done probably 5. I've never walked the entire Camino de Santiago, but I've walked great lengths of it, and I've done the Portuguese Camino. I've done the Camino del Nord. I've done the French Camino. But because it ends in Galicia, I became fascinated with the wines of Galicia, in particular El Barino. And this is going back 15 or more years, and I thought, I could see El Barino was starting to catch on internationally. When I'd do the Camino, I'd always go to London and I'd see El Barino on wine list. And I came back and I said to Rollo, there's this variety that I'd never heard of till I tasted it in Spain, but it's El Barino, and I think we should get some. It'll be the next big thing. Makes a very delicious white wine, unique. So I hunted some down here in Australia, some grapevines, brought them across. We planted 2 acres. I'm pointing out the window. Just 30 meters from where I'm sitting, we planted 2 acres of El Barino. Our first vintage was 2008. We made the wine, we bottled it. It was Ken says promises, but really delivers well. You've never tasted our El Barino. Anyway, we put it into the market. Went gangbusters. People loved it more because it was catching on than anything, I think. In 2009, on the day before Good Friday, when we were just about to pick 2009 vintage El Barino, we got an email from the Australian Wine and Brandy Corporation saying, all you growers out there in Australia who believe you have El Barino planted, we have an update for you. It's not El Barino. It's a French variety called Sauvignon. It's now been proven by a great in-depth study that, yes, you all think you've got El Barino, but you haven't. So we all got together and said, well, what the hell do we do? Given that El Barino was going to go off like a skyrocket, Rollo actually kept going to meetings in Adelaide with the Australian Wine and Brandy Corporation board. They gave us 12 months to get labels off the wine and not sell it as El Barino. So we called our wine Tributo a Galicia, tribute to Galicia. Bit nothing, but no one understood what that meant, and we saw our sales of the wine decline. And of course, you have to remember that at this time, no one in Australia, Ken probably was well, but the wines of the Vin Jaune made with the variety Sauvignon. But to be quite honest, I don't think I'd even heard of great variety Sauvignon up until that time. Savagnin. And of course, a lot of people would say, oh, yes, Sauvignon. Of course, we know Sauvignon. No, nothing to do with Sauvignon. It's Savagnin. We floundered around trying to sell it as tribute to Galicia. No, that never caught on. And it was about 2013. I said to Rollo, who was then doing the winemaking, in about November, oh, what have you done with that bloody oddball variety Sauvignon this year? He said, oh, I'm just having a play around. I said, well, yes, but what? He said, oh, well, I'll meet you tomorrow in the wine room. We'll do a tasting. He took me to a barrel, pulled the bung out, siphoned some wine out. You've gone bananas, Rollo. This is disgusting. This is awful. This is the most appalling one. What are you getting at? He said, well, this is Sauvignon in the Vin Jaune style. It's oxidized. I said, bloody oath, it's oxidized. Anyway, I seriously thought, come on, I trained you better than this. You know an oxidized wine when you see one. Don't try and fob this off. Anyway, eventually I did a little bit of research. I read about Sauvignon. I read about Vin Jaune. I read about the Syrah in France near the Swiss border. I bought some Syrah wines. I tasted them. It took me a while to get my head around the style, but I eventually did. And I'm now a profound lover of the Syrah wines. And I have nothing but admiration for Rollo in doing what he did, even though he chose not to tell me. It's my money you're playing with here, boy.
Gary, can I chip in? You need to give me some advice. I've got a couple of 30-year-old bottles in the cellar, and I haven't opened them because I'm never sure what to drink them with. What the hell do you drink them with?
There is a classic dish of the Syrah, and it's a chicken dish. I will dig it out. I'll send the recipe to Andrew, and he can. And it is an exceptional.
Please.
In fact,
I'll post it on the website.
Yes, I was in Brisbane earlier this year, and a friend of mine took me to have dinner with a French friend of hers, quite a well-known photographer in Brisbane, who grew up in the Syrah. So he was right across everything, and his wife cooked this very dish, this chicken dish, and he served a bottle of 1990 Vin Jaune from Tissot, Tissot.
That's what I've got.
What vintage?
I could look it up in the database very quickly.
Anyway, this was
around that though, yes.
Yeah, 1990, and it was exceptional. And we had it paired with our 2015 Vin Jaune lookalike, I think it was. So there you go. That was something of a breakthrough. In fact, once again, to Rollo's great credit, he's done a huge amount of background work to come to grips with the peculiarities of making a Vin Jaune style. And I think, in fact, he is getting the credit now for making the most interesting Sauvignon outside of France. We've had French sommeliers come here say, we can't believe what you're doing with this wine.
Gary, I've got the 92 Chateau Chalon.
Okay. Are you in Brisbane?
No, we're 1,000 k's north of Brisbane.
Right. Okay.
Ken's just north of Mackay.
Yeah, just okay. But can I just add a tidbit of information for fun for everyone? Of course, the bottles that these wines come in are the Clavelin. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
And of course, they make a thing of how, because they're aged and they have the floor on them, they lose a certain amount. So they bottle them in 62 centiliter bottles, not 650, 750s.
Not 750.
No, sounds fascinating. Well, gang,
Just a further insight on the floor, and which of course
Yep.
is both protective and oxidative. It was only when Rollo went to the Jura and spent a week there talking to growers that he discovered a critical thing in the maturation of that Vin style is you must never move the barrel. So, but of course, up until then, here he would we'd have them in this part of the wine cellar. Oh, it got to make some space, pick them up, move them over. And what that does, it fractures the yeast floor on the surface and back to square one. And now he has a dedicated part of the cellar where once the wines go to barrel, and our floor is indigenous, it's not inoculated, it comes normally. The barrel is never moved, never bumped, never touched. In fact, when someone takes a sample, it's like a medical operation.
Love it.
fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. We might have to sort of work in one of those in a future week.
Not hard.
Gang, that'll be good. Gang, I'm going to end shortly, and we'll head off for Father's Day dinner and things like that. So I hope that all goes well. Obviously, there's next week and the week after, and hopefully those of you who've got the wines can look forward to that. And Gary, hopefully you can please join us if you wish. We'll make sure you get the Zoom code for next week and the week after. And at the suggestion of Wine Experience, I'm going to, we're going to get the October wines and themes sorted as well, and on the website in the next few days for those that wish to get it, to make sure there's a lot of lead time, because it seems to be getting worse. God knows where it's all going to end up just at the moment. And
Can I ask a question?
there's the rumours for us here in Queensland, or in southeast Queensland anyway, for more shutdown stuff, to see what happens. So, but I'll be in touch about that. Ken, you want to say something?
No, I was just crossing my fingers for you. We're okay.
Sorry, I get it
still,
right.
Pippa wants to say something.
You're in slightly more.
I was just going to say that our youngest son announced his engagement today because he's sick of waiting for the end of lockdown. So he popped the question anyway. So I'm wondering, does anyone have a favourite celebratory bubbles bottle that you would recommend that we might get?
What price
you
bracket?
know, we need like 3 weeks to get it here, and hopefully by the time lockdown ends, we can all get together and have. Oh, well, what do you think would be? I don't.
How many of you will be celebrating when the bottle arrives? Do you need a Magnum?
10.
Oh, you might need a Magnum then. Why don't you get a Magnum of Roederer, the one that Ken mentioned
Well, that's
before?
what it was. That was what made me think of it.
Yeah.
The 242 Jancis Robinson doesn't like it.
Oh no, I think. Well, let's forget about Jancis. I think Roederer is fantastic.
I can't believe that that's a correct report of her score.
No,
Please do look on her website and tell me, will you, Andrew?
Yeah, I'll have a look.
Maybe
But
she had I can't imagine that she had a bad bottle and didn't realise it and didn't open a second bottle or something. So I'm really interested to see, because a 5, 6, 7 point discrepancy in the tasting of different people is fairly significant.
It is, yeah. I think Roederer would be lovely, and you can get Magnums relatively. If Wine Experience does have them, for example, if you want to go shopping on the website, but I mean, you'll be able to buy it.
Do you think it's worth getting Magnums though? Because the
Well, you
price
could always get
premium,
2 750s, Ken. You could. There's something
Exactly.
celebratory about all out of one big bottle, isn't there?
You could decant it. People forget that decanting champagne is actually worth doing.
Okay.
Most
Well,
people
there's
don't, yes,
thought
most
for
people
another-
don't think of
Well, that's
decanting
the
champagne.
problem.
You probably want to chill the decanter first.
Right.
But
Makes
if
them
you've
taste
got
better.
two bottles and decanted them into a chilled decanter, that would be an acceptable alternative and much cheaper.
I think, Philippa, that sounds like you've got a couple of suggestions there. I think we're all approving of Roederer. I would.
All right.
Well,
Fantastic.
anyway, congratulations on all that.
Oh,
Anyway,
yes.
gang, enjoy Father's Day, what remains of it, and dinner tonight. And we shall we'll see everybody and others next Sunday at 5 p.m. And keep an eye out. I'll try and organise the October program. So lovely to see everybody, and we'll catch up. Thanks, Gary. We'll hopefully see you next Sunday.
See you later.
Thanks for the
Good night,
contribution.
folks. Great to see you all.
Happy lockdown.
Bye.
Yeah, that's right.